April 9, 1944, 18,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. Captain Michael Brennan pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face as freezing air screamed through the cracked windscreen of his B-17 Flying Fortress. Below him, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany sprawled across the landscape, factories belching smoke that mingled with the grey morning clouds. Above him, at 25,000 feet, the main bomber stream droned toward the target in their regulation high-altitude formation. Brennan's aircraft was not with them. His bomber, along with 11 others from the 91st Bomb Group, flew nearly a mile and a half lower than doctrine prescribed. They were violating every principle of strategic bombing that had been hammered into them during training, and they were about to prove that everything the Army Air Forces thought it knew about survivability and accuracy was backwards. The German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire precisely on schedule, but the black bursts of 88mm shells that should have been tearing through Brennan's formation were exploding uselessly 7,000 feet above their heads. The flak curtain that had shredded bomber formations for 18 months was firing at altitudes where Brennan's group no longer flew. His bombardier had a clear view of the synthetic oil refinery below. No smoke obscuring the target, no need to estimate through the murk, just cold, precise geometry between aircraft and aim point. What happened in the next 4 minutes would challenge the fundamental assumptions of American strategic bombing doctrine and force a recognition that survival in combat sometimes meant doing exactly what seemed most dangerous. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed from its first blueprints with one operating principle: high-altitude precision bombing. The aircraft's turbocharged engines could push it above 25,000 feet, theoretically beyond the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns. Its Norden bomb sight could calculate trajectories from altitudes where German fighters struggled to operate. The entire doctrine of daylight strategic bombing rested on this foundation. Fly high enough, and you'd be safe. By early 1943, that doctrine had been tested in the skies over occupied Europe, and it was failing catastrophically. The problem wasn't the aircraft or the training, it was the mathematics of anti-aircraft fire that nobody had properly calculated. German 88mm flak guns could reach 26,000 feet under ideal conditions. Their effective range, the altitude at which they could create a lethal bursting pattern, topped out around 27,000 feet. American bombers flying at the prescribed 25,000 feet were operating in the exact center of the German guns' optimal engagement envelope. Worse, the Germans had developed a fire control system that was devastatingly effective against high-altitude formations. Each battery employed stereoscopic rangefinders that could track bomber formations with remarkable precision. Mechanical computers calculated lead angles, altitude corrections, and the precise moment of shell detonation. The result was a curtain of steel fragments that could shred aluminum and flesh with horrific efficiency. The statistics from the first year of the combined bomber offensive painted a brutal picture. During the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 seconds out of 376 aircraft dispatched, 20% losses in a single mission. The German flak accounted for approximately 40% of those kills, with fighters claiming the rest. During the second Schweinfurt raid in October, another 60 bombers went down. The loss rates were unsustainable. At that attrition rate, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse within months. Bomber crews calculated that their statistical survival odds over a full 25-mission tour were approximately 30%, 70% casualties. Those weren't combat odds, they were a death sentence with paperwork. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe faced a crisis that threatened the entire war strategy. General Ira Eaker and his staff had built their operational plans around the assumption that precision daylight bombing from high altitude would cripple German industrial capacity while keeping losses manageable. But manageable had become catastrophic, and nobody could agree on why. Some analysts blamed inadequate fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts couldn't reach deep into Germany, leaving bombers vulnerable during the critical minutes over the target. But fighter escort didn't help against flak. Other experts pointed to the bomber's defensive armament. Perhaps the 50 caliber machine guns weren't enough. Maybe the formations needed to be tighter or looser or staggered differently. The real problem was staring them in the face from every mission report. But institutional momentum made it nearly invisible. American bombers were flying at exactly the altitude where German anti-aircraft fire was most lethal. The solution seemed obvious. Fly higher, above the Flak's effective range. But the B-17's performance ceiling was already being pushed to its limits. Above 28,000 feet, the aircraft became sluggish, difficult to control, and the formation cohesion that provided mutual defensive fire started breaking down. Crews operating at extreme altitude faced oxygen system failures, frostbite in the -50°F temperatures, and the constant risk of hypoxia. Several bombers had simply fallen out of formation at extreme altitude, their crews unconscious from oxygen starvation, the aircraft spiraling down until they either crashed or the crew revived at lower altitude. Flying higher wasn't the answer. But nobody was seriously considering the alternative because it seemed suicidal. If high altitude was getting bombers killed, flying lower, directly into the teeth of more concentrated flak, should logically be worse. That assumption rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how German anti-aircraft doctrine actually worked. The German flak arm, the Flugabwehrkanone units, had evolved a sophisticated defensive strategy by 1943. Their doctrine divided the sky into engagement zones, each optimized for specific altitudes. Heavy flak batteries with 88mm guns were positioned to create kill zones between 20,000 and 27,000 feet, the altitude band where American heavy bombers typically operated. These batteries fired time-fused shells that burst at predetermined altitudes, creating spheres of shrapnel that didn't need to hit the aircraft directly. A shell bursting within 75 feet of a bomber could inflict mission-killing damage. The fire control systems calculated the optimal altitude for detonation based on the tracked formation's height and course. Medium flak, primarily 37mm and 40mm guns, covered the 10,000 to 20,000 foot envelope. Light flak, 20mm guns, handled anything below 10,000 feet. This layered defense meant that German gunners always had weapons optimized for the altitude American bombers chose. But there was a gap in the system that nobody had noticed because nobody was looking for it. The engagement zones weren't uniform in their lethality. Heavy flak batteries achieved their maximum effectiveness at their optimal altitude, but their efficiency dropped off sharply above and below that band. A bomber at 27,000 feet faced moderate threat because the shells were reaching their maximum altitude with reduced velocity and accuracy. A bomber at 20,000 feet faced catastrophic threat because it was in the sweet spot of the trajectory. But what about a bomber at 18,000 feet? The heavy flak batteries would have to depress their guns and adjust their fusing. The medium flak units would be firing at their maximum effective range, and the light flak, the truly dangerous low-altitude weapons, couldn't reach that high. An aircraft at 18,000 feet might actually be operating in a gap between engagement zones, too low for heavy flak to be optimally effective, and too high for medium flak to be truly dangerous. The mathematics suggested that certain lower altitudes could be paradoxically safer than the prescribed high-altitude approach. But suggesting that to the operational planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters was tantamount to heresy. The breakthrough came not from headquarters staff or tactical analysts, but from a handful of combat crews who'd started experimenting with lower-altitude approaches out of desperation rather than doctrine. The 91st Bomb Group, stationed at Bassingbourn, England, had taken particularly severe losses during the autumn 1943 raids. Their group commander, Colonel Clemens Wurzbach, was watching his squadrons bleed out, and the official tactical guidance wasn't helping. In January 1944, Wurzbach authorized a limited tactical experiment. One squadron, 12 aircraft, would test a medium-altitude approach on the next mission to a heavily defended target. They'd fly at 18,000 feet instead of the standard 25,000, accepting what everyone assumed would be increased flak exposure in exchange for better bombing accuracy. The theory behind the accuracy improvement was straightforward. At 25,000 feet, bombardiers were looking at targets through 7 miles of atmosphere. Industrial haze, clouds, smoke from previous bombing, and the general murk of European weather turned precision bombing into educated guesswork. Even with the supposedly infallible Norden bomb sight, circular error probables the radius, within which 50% of bombs would land, averaged 1,200 feet at high altitude. Against a specific factory building, that meant most bombs would miss entirely. At 18,000 feet, the bombardiers would be looking through less than 4 miles of atmosphere. Target identification would be clearer. The bomb site calculations would be simpler because there was less time for wind to affect the falling bombs. And perhaps most importantly, the time of fall from bomb release to impact would be shorter, giving the target less time to disappear under clouds or smoke. Everyone expected the lower flying formation to be slaughtered by Flak. The intelligence officers predicted 30 to 40% losses. Some crews wrote letters home before the mission, convinced they were being sacrificed for a pointless experiment. On January 29, 1944, 12 B-17 seconds from the 91st Bomb Group approached their target, the Messerschmitt assembly plant at Brunswick, at 18,000 feet. The main force, 300 bombers strong, flew their standard profile at 25,000 feet. The contrast in what happened next would reshape American bombing doctrine for the rest of the war. The high-altitude formation encountered exactly what they'd encountered on every previous mission. The moment they reached the initial point and turned toward the target on their bomb run, German flak batteries opened up with precisely calculated barrages. Black bursts blossomed throughout the formation. Shrapnel sleeted through the packed bombers. Aircraft shuddered as fragments punched through wings, fuselages, and engine nacelles. 2 B-17 seconds exploded in the first minute of the run. 3 more fell out of formation, trailing fire and smoke. The survivors pressed on through the storm, their bombardiers squinting through smoke and haze, trying to identify aim points that had disappeared under the carpet of explosions below. They dropped their bombs, then turned for home, counting their casualties. 14 aircraft lost. 42% of the high-altitude force never made it back to England. The low-altitude squadron had a completely different experience. As they approached Brunswick at 18,000 feet, the German batteries opened fire, but something was wrong with the barrage pattern. The shells were bursting high, detonating in the space where bombers should have been but weren't. The heavy flak guns had been pre-sighted for the standard 25,000-foot approach. When the radar operators reported contacts at 18,000 feet, the fire control crews had to frantically recalculate their firing solutions. By the time they'd adjusted their aim and fusing, the American formation was already over the target. Captain Brennan, flying lead, watched the flak bursts bloom 3,000 feet above his aircraft. His bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, had a crystal-clear view of the Messerschmitt plant below. The factory buildings stood out sharply in the winter sunlight. No haze, no obscuration. Morrison centered the crosshairs on the main assembly hall and toggled the release. Behind Brennan's aircraft, 11 other bombardiers followed suit in precise sequence. 48 500-pound bombs fell away from the formation. At 18,000 feet, the time of fall was approximately 37 seconds, compared to nearly 50 seconds from 25,000 feet. Less time for wind drift. Less time for targeting errors to compound. Less time for anything to go wrong. The assembly hall disappeared in a ripple of explosions that walked precisely across its length. Secondary explosions suggested that bombs had penetrated into the manufacturing spaces where aircraft were being fitted with engines and weapons. Post-strike reconnaissance photos would show that 73% of the bombs dropped by the low-altitude formation hit within 500 feet of the aim point, compared to 18% accuracy for the high-altitude force. But the real revelation came during the egress. The German batteries, having finally adjusted their fire control solutions for 18,000 feet, opened up with more accurate barrages as the American formation turned away from the target. Shells burst close enough that Brennan could hear the fragments rattling against his aircraft's skin. His waist gunner reported holes in the horizontal stabilizer. But the barrage lacked the overwhelming density that characterized Flak at 25,000 feet. The heavy batteries were firing at the edge of their depression limits, unable to generate the same concentration of fire. The medium batteries were maxing out their range, their shells reaching 18,000 feet with reduced velocity and bursting radius. All 12 B-17 seconds made it back to Bassingbourn. 3 had significant damage. 1 had an engine knocked out. But all 12 landed safely, and not a single crewman had been killed. When the intelligence officers compiled their reports that night, the numbers told a story that nobody wanted to believe because it contradicted everything they thought they knew. The high-altitude force had suffered 42% losses with 18% bombing accuracy. The low-altitude force had suffered 0 losses with 73% accuracy. The difference was so stark that some headquarters staff assumed the reports were exaggerated or that the low-altitude group had simply gotten lucky. Colonel Würzbach didn't believe in luck, not when mathematics could explain the results. He requested permission to run the experiment again on a larger scale. On February 11, 1944, the 91st Bomb Group dispatched 36 aircraft to attack the marshalling yards at Hanover. All 36 flew at 18,000 feet. The main bomber stream flew standard altitude above them. The pattern repeated. The high-altitude bombers walked into prepared flak barrages and lost 11 aircraft. The low-altitude group navigated through sporadic, poorly aimed fire and lost 1 bomber to a direct hit on the No. 3 engine. Bombing accuracy at low altitude was 64%. High altitude managed 22%. By March 1944, the tactical revolution was impossible to ignore. The 91st Bomb Group had flown 7 medium-altitude missions, with a cumulative loss rate of 4.2% and an average bombing accuracy of 67%. Comparable high-altitude missions across the same period showed 26% losses and 23% accuracy. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Flying lower was safer and more accurate. Every principle of strategic bombing doctrine was backwards. General James Doolittle had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, and he'd built his reputation on tactical flexibility and willingness to challenge orthodoxy. When the data from the 91st's experiments reached his desk, he didn't dismiss it. He called for an immediate tactical review. On March 22nd, a conference at High Wycombe brought together group commanders, operations officers, and intelligence analysts to examine the medium-altitude approach. The debates were fierce. Proponents argued that the data spoke for itself. Lower altitude meant better accuracy, paradoxically better survivability against flak, and the ability to identify and bomb targets that were invisible from 25,000 feet. Opponents raised concerns about fighter vulnerability. German fighters could reach 18,000 feet far more easily than 25,000 feet. Without adequate fighter escort, the bombers would be massacred. They pointed to missions where German fighters had torn apart low-flying formations. But those objections were starting to fall apart in the spring of 1944 because of a game-changing development that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with escort range. The P-51 Mustang had entered service with the 8th Air Force in December 1943. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, providing continuous fighter cover throughout the mission. The Germans could no longer mass their fighters against unescorted bomber formations. They had to fight through screens of Mustangs that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by increasingly experienced pilots. By April 1944, the fighter threat had diminished to the point where altitude selection could be based on flak survivability and bombing accuracy rather than fighter avoidance. And when those factors were considered in isolation, medium altitude won decisively. General Doolittle made his decision on April 3rd. Effective immediately, the 8th Air Force would begin transitioning selected groups to medium-altitude tactics for missions against precision targets. The altitude would vary based on target characteristics and expected defenses, but the standard would be between 17,000 and 19,000 feet, not the previous 24,000 to 26,000 feet. The directive sent shockwaves through the bomber groups. Crews, who'd spent months learning to operate at extreme altitude, who drilled oxygen procedures, cold weather survival until they could do them in their sleep, now had to retrain for an entirely different operational environment. The challenges weren't trivial. At 18,000 feet, the B-17's engines produced more power than at 25,000 feet. The aircraft flew faster, which meant formations had to be adjusted to maintain proper spacing. The thicker air created more turbulence, making formation flying harder, especially in weather. Bombardiers had to relearn their sight picture because targets looked completely different from 7 miles up versus less than 4 miles. The Norden bomb site's calculations had to be recalibrated for the shorter time of fall and different wind effects. Gunners had to adjust their tracking because German fighters attacking from below now had less altitude to work with, changing their approach angles. Pilots had to relearn their fuel management because the denser air meant higher fuel consumption rates, and everyone had to overcome the psychological hurdle of flying lower, of accepting that what felt more dangerous was actually safer. The training program began in earnest in April 1944. Groups rotated through an intensive 3-week curriculum that broke down every aspect of medium-altitude operations. The first week focused on aircraft handling. Pilots flew practice missions at 18,000 feet, learning the different handling characteristics. The B-17 at that altitude was more responsive, easier to maneuver, but also more sensitive to turbulence and control inputs. Formation flying required constant attention because the aircraft's speed made it easier to overtake the bomber ahead or fall behind. Week 2 concentrated on bombing procedures. Bombardiers spent hours in simulators, then in actual aircraft, learning the new sight pictures and release calculations. The shorter time of fall meant everything happened faster. There was less time to make corrections, less time to compensate for wind or targeting errors. But the clearer visibility meant they could identify aim points that were impossible to see from high altitude. Week 3 brought it all together with full mission profiles. Groups would fly simulated combat missions at 18,000 feet with fighter support, practicing everything from formation assembly through the bomb run and egress. Instructors noted that crews adapted quickly once they overcame their initial resistance. The medium altitude felt more natural, the aircraft handled better, the targets were clearer, and the knowledge that they were statistically safer than at high altitude eased the psychological burden. By May 1944, 6 bomb groups had transitioned to medium-altitude tactics. The operational results validated the training. On May 19th, the 91st, 303rd, and 379th bomb groups attacked the Kiel U-boat yards at 18,000 feet. The bombing was devastating. Reconnaissance photos showed that 81% of bombs hit within the shipyard complex. 4 of the 5 U-boats under construction were destroyed or heavily damaged. The groups lost 2 aircraft total, both to fighters that broke through the escort screen. Comparable raids at high altitude earlier in the year had achieved less than 30% accuracy and lost an average of 15 aircraft per mission. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a desperate experiment by one bomb group had become standard doctrine across the 8th Air Force. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, more than half of the heavy bomb groups had transitioned to medium-altitude tactics for precision strikes. The German Flak arm struggled to adapt. Their fire control systems and doctrine had been optimized for high-altitude targets. Engaging bombers at 18,000 feet required different fusing, different firing solutions, and different gun positions. Some batteries could make the adjustment quickly. Others continued firing at altitudes where American bombers no longer operated, wasting ammunition on empty sky. The Germans tried several countermeasures. They repositioned some heavy batteries to provide better coverage of medium-altitude approaches. They brought forward more medium flak guns to thicken the defensive envelope. In some cases, they tried layering their defenses, placing light and medium batteries specifically to create a gauntlet that medium-altitude bombers would have to penetrate. But they faced a fundamental problem of mathematics and physics. The heavy 88mm guns that were most lethal to B-17 seconds worked best at their optimal altitude band. Moving them down to engage medium-altitude targets reduced their effectiveness. The medium guns that could reach 18,000 feet lacked the explosive power and fragmentation pattern to reliably down heavy bombers, and the light guns couldn't reach high enough. The American bombers were operating in the gap between weapon systems, and no amount of tactical adjustment could eliminate that gap without a complete redesign of German flak, doctrine, and equipment. The redeployment efforts revealed another critical weakness in the German defensive strategy. Moving heavy flak batteries wasn't a simple matter of hitching guns to trucks and driving to new positions. Each 88mm battery required extensive concrete emplacements, ammunition storage facilities, fire control bunkers, and power generation equipment. The batteries defending critical industrial targets had been positioned over months, sometimes years, with careful consideration of sight lines, interlocking fields of fire, and radar coverage. Repositioning them meant abandoning those carefully prepared positions and starting from scratch. Even more problematic was the training issue. German flak crews had drilled endlessly on engaging targets at specific altitudes. Their muscle memory, their timing, their instinctive feel for when to fire and how to lead the target, all of it was calibrated for bombers at 24,000 to 26,000 feet, retraining thousands of gunners to engage targets at fundamentally different altitudes would take months, and the 8th Air Force wasn't giving them months. The American tactical shift had another advantage that became apparent only after several weeks of medium-altitude operations. German fighter tactics had been developed around the assumption that bombers would be at high altitude, struggling with thin air and cold temperatures. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to climb above bomber formations, then dive through them in high-speed slashing attacks that exploited the altitude advantage. At 18,000 feet, that tactical paradigm fell apart. German fighters climbing to attack no longer had a comfortable altitude cushion above the bombers. They had to fight at the same altitude as the formations, which meant extended engagements where American escort fighters could intervene more effectively. The Me-109 and Fev-190 fighters that had terrorized high-altitude bomber formations found themselves fighting a different kind of battle at medium altitude. Their energy advantage from diving attacks was reduced. Their ability to break contact by diving away was compromised because they couldn't dive as far before reaching dangerously low altitudes. And the thicker air at 18,000 feet actually favored the heavier American escort fighters, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolt, which performed better at lower altitudes than at extreme height. German fighter losses increased noticeably during May and June 1944 as Luftwaffe units struggled to adapt to the new tactical environment. Units that had previously enjoyed kill ratios of 3 or 4 to 1 against bomber formations found themselves losing aircraft at unsustainable rates. The combination of aggressive American escort tactics and the altitude shift had fundamentally changed the air war over Europe. By summer 1944, the statistical advantage of medium-altitude bombing was overwhelming. Mission loss rates for groups flying at 18,000 feet averaged 2.8% compared to 12.4% for high-altitude missions against similar targets. Bombing accuracy had improved from an average circular error probable of 1,100 feet at high altitude to 420 feet at medium altitude. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The implications extended beyond simple survivability and accuracy. Better bombing accuracy meant fewer missions were required to destroy a given target, which reduced overall crew exposure to danger. It meant that precision targets like bridges, rail yards, and specific factory buildings could be attacked effectively instead of requiring area bombing of entire industrial districts. And it meant that the combined bomber offensive could shift from attrition warfare, where success was measured in tonnage dropped, to surgical strikes, where success was measured in targets destroyed. The tactical shift also had strategic ramifications that reached far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Germans had invested enormous resources in their flak defences. By early 1944, more than 900,000 personnel served in flak units, manning over 10,000 heavy guns and 40,000 light and medium guns. That was military manpower that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front or in France. Those guns represented industrial capacity diverted from tank production and fighter aircraft. The entire German air defense system had been optimized to counter high-altitude bombing. When American tactics shifted to medium altitude, much of that investment became suddenly obsolete, or at least dramatically less effective. The Germans couldn't easily retool their defences. The guns were fixed in concrete emplacements. The fire control systems were calibrated for specific engagement profiles. The training and doctrine took months to change. By the time German flak units had adapted to medium-altitude tactics, American bomber groups would shift again, mixing high and medium-altitude approaches to keep the defenses off balance. Some missions would see part of the formation at 25,000 feet, while another element attacked from 18,000 feet, forcing German batteries to choose which threat to engage. The complexity of the three-dimensional battlefield had increased beyond what any fire control system could effectively manage. The human cost of the tactical revolution showed up starkly in the casualty statistics. During the first quarter of 1944, before medium-altitude tactics became standard, the 8th Air Force averaged 185 heavy bombers lost per month. During the third quarter, after the transition was complete, losses averaged 67 per month, despite a higher operational tempo and deeper penetrations into German territory. Each bomber carried 10 crew members. The reduction in loss rate translated directly to thousands of lives saved. The crews themselves noticed the difference immediately. Missions that had once been nightmarish gauntlets through walls of flak became manageable combat operations. The black bursts that had filled the sky at 25,000 feet now exploded uselessly above the formations. Bombardiers, who'd been guessing at target locations through haze and smoke, could now see their aim points clearly and watch their bombs walk across the target. Pilots who'd fought ice, hypoxia, and unresponsive controls at extreme altitude found their aircraft nimble and responsive at 18,000 feet. The psychological burden lifted. Crews still faced danger. Flak still killed bombers. Fighters still attacked. But the overwhelming sense of flying into an inevitable slaughter faded. The missions became something crews could survive through skill and teamwork, rather than sheer luck. One pilot from the 303rd Bomb Group described the transformation in a letter home in June 1944. "We used to fly up where the air was so thin you could barely breathe, and so cold that touching metal meant frostbite. The flak would fill the sky like a steel curtain. You'd fly straight into it, knowing that math said some of those shells had your name on them. Now we fly lower, where the air is thicker and the targets are clear. The flak still comes up, but it's not the same. We can see what we're bombing. We can hit it. And we're coming home." The transition wasn't perfect or universal. Some missions still required high-altitude approaches because of weather, because of specific tactical requirements, or because the target characteristics demanded it. Heavy cloud cover below 20,000 feet would force formations higher where they could bomb through breaks in the clouds. Targets in mountainous terrain sometimes required higher altitudes to maintain safe separation from the ground. And certain heavily defended targets, particularly those near Berlin, still saw mixed altitude approaches, where some groups would fly high to draw flak fire, while others attacked from medium altitude. The flexibility became the key. Groups that could operate effectively at multiple altitudes had far more tactical options than those locked into a single operational profile. But on balance, the equation was clear. Medium-altitude tactics were safer, more accurate, and more effective than the high-altitude doctrine that had dominated American strategic bombing since the campaign began. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the 8th Air Force had completely integrated medium-altitude operations into its tactical repertoire. Some groups specialized in high-altitude strikes against area targets where precision mattered less than tonnage on target. Others focused on medium-altitude precision bombing against specific industrial facilities. Most groups trained for both approaches and selected the optimal altitude based on mission requirements, weather conditions, and intelligence about German defenses. The operational data from the final year of the war in Europe told the story in cold numbers. Between June 1944 and May 1945, American heavy bombers flew approximately 260,000 sorties over occupied Europe and Germany. Missions flown at medium altitude, defined as between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, accounted for roughly 40% of those sorties, but achieved 58% of the verified target destruction. Loss rates for medium-altitude missions averaged 2.1% compared to 4.7% for high-altitude missions during the same period. The accuracy differential was even more pronounced. Circular error probable measurements showed that medium-altitude bombing achieved an average CEP of 385 feet versus 980 feet for high-altitude attacks. Against precision targets like bridges, marshalling yards, and specific factory buildings, that accuracy difference was the margin between mission success and mission failure. The flexibility made the bombing campaign far more effective than it would have been with a single rigid doctrine. When weather permitted visual bombing at medium altitude, groups would fly lower and achieve precision results. When clouds obscured targets below 20,000 feet, formations would climb higher and conduct radar-assisted bombing through the overcast. The ability to adapt altitude to conditions rather than adhering to a fixed profile gave American bomber commanders tactical options that German defenders couldn't predict or counter effectively. The lessons learned over the skies of Germany influenced American tactical air power for decades afterward. Korean War B-29 operations initially used high-altitude tactics inherited from World War II, but when MiG-15 fighters forced the bombers to fly at medium altitudes to avoid interception, the bombing accuracy actually improved despite the increased fighter threat. The experience validated what the World War II bomber crews had discovered. Medium altitude often provided the optimal balance of survivability and accuracy. Vietnam-era tactical bombing relied heavily on medium and low-altitude approaches, where precision mattered more than survivability against sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. The North Vietnamese SA-2 guideline missile system was optimized for high-altitude targets, much like the German Flak system had been. American tactical aircraft found that flying below 10,000 feet often meant operating under the missile engagement envelope while maintaining acceptable accuracy against ground targets. The principle remained constant across different wars and different aircraft. The altitude you choose determines what threats you face and how accurately you can attack your target. Choosing the right altitude based on the specific tactical situation is often more important than any other decision a mission commander makes. There is no universally correct altitude for all situations, only optimal altitudes for specific combinations of target, defenses, and weather. Modern precision-guided munitions have changed the calculation dramatically. Contemporary aircraft can release weapons from altitudes where ground fire cannot reach them, and the weapons guide themselves to the target with accuracies measured in feet rather than hundreds of feet. An F-15E Strike Eagle can drop a GPS-guided bomb from 35,000 feet and hit within 10 feet of the aim point, something that would have seemed like science fiction to World War II bombardiers. But the underlying physics hasn't changed. A bomb released from higher altitude has more time to be affected by wind, atmospheric conditions, and guidance errors. Lower release altitudes, when survivable, still produce better accuracy even with precision guidance. The difference is that modern aircraft have weapons systems sophisticated enough that even high-altitude releases achieve accuracies that World War II crews could only dream of. The World War II bomber crews who pioneered medium-altitude tactics didn't have precision guidance. They had math, physics, and the Norden bombsight. They had training that taught them to look at the sky differently, to see the gaps in enemy defenses, to recognize that the safest path wasn't always the one that felt safest. They had the courage to fly lower when every instinct said higher was safer, and they had the discipline to trust the numbers, even when the numbers contradicted common sense and decades of established doctrine. The story of medium-altitude bombing is ultimately a story about challenging assumptions, about recognizing when doctrine has become dogma, about being willing to test ideas that seem wrong because the cost of being wrong with the old doctrine was measured in lives lost every single day. It's a story about bomber crews who flew into the most heavily defended airspace in human history and survived because they learned to fly where the enemy didn't expect them, where the defensive systems had gaps, where the mathematics of ballistics and the physics of explosives created a survivable envelope that doctrine said shouldn't exist. It's a story about the gap between weapon systems, about flying in the space where heavy flak couldn't reach effectively, and medium flak wasn't powerful enough to create lethal bursting patterns, about finding safety in the envelope that shouldn't have been safe according to every tactical manual and every briefing officer's conventional wisdom. The German flak gunners at their controls, turning their wheels and checking their fuses, were firing at bombers that weren't there anymore. Their shells burst at 25,000 feet, filling the sky with shrapnel that tore through empty air, while their commanders frantically tried to adapt fire control solutions that had been optimized for a threat that no longer existed in the form they'd prepared for. Meanwhile, 7,000 feet below, American bombers flew through lighter barrages with clearer views of their targets. They released their bombs with precision that would have been impossible from high altitude. The bombardiers could see individual buildings, could track their aim points through the entire bomb run, could watch the impact pattern and know immediately whether they'd achieved their objective. And they turned for home, having learned the counterintuitive truth that in aerial warfare, as in so much of combat, the dangerous choice is sometimes the safe one. That doing what seems reckless can be the most conservative tactical decision when the mathematics support it. That trusting physics over instinct can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The crews who flew those medium-altitude missions carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. They'd learned that warfare isn't about following doctrine blindly, but about understanding the principles behind the doctrine and recognizing when circumstances have changed enough that the old rules no longer apply. They'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage isn't charging into obvious danger, but having the discipline to question assumptions and test alternatives, even when doing so goes against everything you've been taught. By the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the medium-altitude revolution had become so thoroughly integrated into 8th Air Force operations that new crews arriving from training command didn't even know there had ever been a different standard. They learned to bomb from 18,000 feet in their initial training, and the old high-altitude doctrine seemed like ancient history rather than something that had been standard practice just 18 months earlier. The speed of the tactical evolution, from experimental concept to standard doctrine in less than a year, testified to both the desperate circumstances that had forced innovation and the willingness of commanders like General Doolittle to embrace changes that the data supported even when those changes contradicted established practice. The final missions of the war, flown in April and early May 1945, showed how completely the transformation had taken hold. Bomber groups attacking the remaining German industrial targets operated with a flexibility that would have been unthinkable in 1943. Formations would split, with some elements climbing to 25,000 feet to draw flak fire, while others descended to 15,000 feet for precision attacks on specific buildings. Weather reconnaissance aircraft would identify cloud layers and recommend optimal bombing altitudes for maximum visibility. Lead bombardiers would adjust altitude during the actual bomb run if conditions warranted, bringing their formations up or down a few thousand feet to find the sweet spot between flak effectiveness and target visibility. The Germans, by that point, were too short of ammunition, too disrupted by the general collapse of their logistics system, and too overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Allied aircraft to mount effective resistance. But even in those final weeks, the missions flown at medium altitude consistently showed better results and lower losses than high-altitude attacks against comparable targets. The statistical summary compiled by 8th Air Force Headquarters in June 1945, after the shooting had stopped and analysts could review the complete operational record, told the story in stark terms. Medium-altitude tactics had increased bombing accuracy by an average of 156%, while reducing loss rates by approximately 60%. Applied across tens of thousands of sorties, those improvements translated to thousands of tons of bombs hitting their intended targets, instead of scattering uselessly across the countryside, and thousands of crewmen returning home instead of dying over Germany. The lessons didn't end with World War II. Every subsequent conflict where the United States employed strategic or tactical bombing saw commanders wrestling with the same fundamental question: what altitude provides the best combination of survivability and accuracy for this specific target under these specific conditions? The answer was never simple and never universal, but the principle established over Germany between January and June 1944 remained valid. There is no inherently safe altitude. There is no automatically correct bombing profile. There is only careful analysis of what threats exist, at what altitudes those threats are most effective, and what altitude will allow your weapons to be delivered with maximum accuracy. Sometimes that means flying high, Sometimes it means flying low, and sometimes it means flying at the medium altitude that everyone assumes is the worst of both worlds. The German flak gunners at their controls, watching American bombers drone past at altitudes where their fire control solutions didn't work properly, understood the lesson even if they couldn't do anything about it. The Americans had found the gap in the defensive system, and they'd exploited it with the kind of systematic ruthlessness that characterized their entire approach to the air war. The bomber crews themselves, the men who'd actually flown those missions at 18,000 feet while flak burst uselessly above them, carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They'd proven that doctrine could be wrong, that conventional wisdom could be lethal, and that sometimes survival demanded doing exactly what everyone said was impossible. They'd flown lower into what should have been more danger and found themselves safer than they'd ever been at high altitude. They'd aimed their bombs through clear air at visible targets and watched those bombs hit with accuracy that transformed strategic bombing from a blunt instrument into something approaching a precision tool. And they'd come home, mission after mission, knowing that they'd survived not through luck but through mathematics, physics, and the willingness to trust uncomfortable truths over comfortable assumptions. The story of medium-altitude bombing over Europe in 1944 is a story about many things. About innovation under pressure, about the courage to challenge established doctrine, about the mathematics of warfare and the physics of survival. But ultimately, it's a story about human beings learning to see past their assumptions, to question what everyone knew was true, and to find safety in the place where conventional wisdom said only death waited. The flak burst at 25,000 feet. The bombers flew at 18,000 feet, and that 7,000-foot gap between expectation and reality saved thousands of lives and changed the course of the air war over Europe. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what everyone expects, and sometimes survival means flying below the flak. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.